Hello and welcome in today's lecture. For today, we have chosen the topic Green Revolution, a Historical Perspective. As you know, modern agriculture in India dates back to 1757. In that critical year, the East India Company, a British soldier trade, at the Battle of Plassey, defeated the Indians. As a result of the defeat, the tax rights of one Bengal district, the 24 Parganas, had to be relinquished to the company. The British footing in India's civil and tax administration grew swiftly as a result. By 1765, the company had taken control of considerable areas of India, particularly in the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, and agriculture in India had been subject to British administration and modernizing influences. Pre-British period. Before this conquest, agriculture in India was a traditional way of life. It was not a mere economic activity. In the autonomous Indian villages, agriculture was the basic life activity of the people. Agriculture formed such an integral part of life in India that an early British officer, Colonel Alexander Walker, observing the agriculture in Malabar in 1820, has written, "In the Malabar, knowledge of husbandry seems as ancient as their history and is the favorite employment of the inhabitants. It is endeared to them by their mode of life and the property that they possess in the soil. The major function of agriculture, if an integrated life activity can at all be analyzed in terms of functions, was to fulfill the life needs of the cultivators and the village community. This independence of the traditional agriculture from external political or economic control was achieved through a social organization that left the village largely autonomous. The obligation of the village to the external political authority was limited to the payment of a small portion of the produce as revenue. On the basis of the revenue records of those times, Dharampal estimates that the portion of the produce payable to the external authority around 1750 was as small as 5%. The political and economic independence of the village and the cultivator was further secured through the independence of the village from external industrial and market influences. This, of course, does not mean that in pre-British India there was no industry or no trade. For the first 100 years of British contact with India, the British traders dealt only in the manufactured goods of India. Largely, the agriculturists carried out textile manufacture, the most important industrial activity of pre-British India, in their free time. This close coordination between agriculture and manufacture ensured the autonomy of the village by making agriculture free of the demands of an external industry or market. That's why the spinning wheel, or charkha, and the handloom, the basic tool of this union, became the symbols of the traditional Indian civilization of independent cultivators and autonomous villages for both Gandhi and Marx. But for Gandhi, these were also the symbols of a resurgent India, of an India made free again through the independence of its agriculture and its villages. Notwithstanding the different perceptions of Gandhi and Marx about the historical role of the pre-British Indian civilization, for both of them, it was the civilization of independent agriculturists organized as autonomous villages, cultivating their land to fulfill their own needs. These autonomous villages organized their own economic and political institutions, including the manufacturing activities. These autonomous and largely self-sufficient village communities had achieved high skill and technological efficiency in both agriculture and manufacture. All available accounts of the early British period suggest that the cultivators had achieved almost complete perfection in the art of agriculture, producing the most abundant crops, the corn standing as thick on the ground as land could well bear it. British period. The British had no use of this Indian concept of agriculture as an autonomous way of life. In their eyes, the agriculture on which they acquired control was nothing but a source of revenue. And they set about the task of collecting more and more revenue with great zeal. According to Dharampal's estimates, around 1750 AD, for every 1000 units of produce, the producer paid 300 as revenue. Only 50 units of these 300 went out to the central authority, the rest remaining within the village. By 1830, they had to give away 650 units as a revenue, 590 of which went to the central authority. As a result of this level of revenue collection, the cultivators and the villagers both were destroyed. But that was a little concern to the British as long as the agriculture kept on performing its new functions of filling the British coffers. Notwithstanding the loss of at least one-third of the inhabitants of the province and the consequent decrease of the cultivation, the net collections of the year 1771 exceeded even those of 1768. The change of view of agriculture from a source of life in India to source of progress in England brought it its wake untold misery. Irrigation works fell into dilapidation. Vast tracts of cultivable land decayed into a state of jungle. The story of that early plunder by the British and the consequent misery of India is well documented, though not so well known among us, the educated Indians. Cultivation was to reappear in the areas that had reverted to jungle. Some irrigation facilities were to be provided. Some of the industrial activity, all of which had been moved from the villages to the stays of Lancashire and Manchester in the early British phase, was to return to the Indian stays. Never again would there be independent cultivators cultivating their land to fulfill their needs. Their needs would always be subservient to the needs of the state, the industry and market, all of which were now severed from agriculture. Agriculture was never again to become a way of life. It had become a mere economic activity. It had been finally modernized. The major instrument of this modernization, besides the naked force used by the early British, was the system of landlords introduced in India for the first time. Independent cultivators cultivating their own piece of land were not likely to put external economic needs before their need to eat and clothe. A landlord, assured of his personal well-being, could be relied upon to produce and sell what the industry or the state needed. By making agriculture responsive to the market and the state, the landlord became the modernizing force. Independent cultivators used to grow what they needed to live rather than produce what was needed to progress. A favorable world market in all export crops and expansion marked the period before the First World War in the domestic manufacturing capacity in textile and jute. Consequently, we find Indian agriculture flourishing in this period and agricultural output rising at a rate faster than the growth of population. It is perhaps one of the best periods in British Indian agriculture, with per capita food availability hovering around 540 grams per day throughout this period, in spite of substantial exports of rice and wheat. Then came World War I, followed by the Great Economic Depression and the World War II. Prices of agricultural produce crashed and Indian agriculture took a nosedive. Interestingly, the only crop that showed expansion in this period was sugarcane, which was granted protection by imposing new tariffs on import. While famine was on the horizon, the area under this commercially favored crop increased by about 40% between 1930 and 1931 and 1938 and 39. Thus, in this 50-year period, we see Indian agriculture going up or down with the worldwide economic forces. These forces, and not the needs of the people, decided how much of what the Indian agriculture would produce. Independence phase. Independence came to India at a time when agriculture was passing through a particularly bad phase. Bengal had just passed through a major famine. Per capita food availability at 470 grams per day in 1946 was dangerously low. Rural indebtedness had been increasing alarmingly. Cultivators were finding difficulties meeting their fixed liabilities such as rent, land revenue, etc., etc. The country was facing an acute shortage of both the commercial crop and the food crops. Only 19.7% of the net sown area within the Indian Union was irrigated. In addition to improving irrigation, it was necessary to take steps to put the cultivators back on the land and reduce rural indebtedness through land reforms. Between 1947 and 48 and 1949 and 50, the net irrigated area increased from 18.9 to 20.2 million hectares. Most of the increase came from increase in the area irrigated by wells, and other minor irrigation facilities kept on increasing at about the same pace, achieving an annual area of increase of 0.67 million hectares of gross irrigated area from the period 1950 to 1951 and from 1968 to 1969. Agricultural production responded well to the restoration of some just order in land relations and the slowly increasing irrigation facilities. Aggregate crop output during the 50s kept on increasing at a rate faster than the population growth. Both the area under crop and the yield per hectare of almost every crop showed a rising trend. However, independent India also wanted to become modern and industrialized. For the modernizing and industrializing India, it was not enough that agricultural output should increase. It was also important that agricultural production should respond to the needs of the market. The report of the National Commission of Agriculture noted the entire industrial sector depends heavily on the supply of food from the agricultural sector. Since a sizable part of the wages of the industrial workers is spent on food items, a sustained supply of food from agricultural sector is a necessary condition for the stability in the industrial sector. Though the slow expansion of irrigation and various land reform measures were leading to a sustained rise in agricultural production, yet this increased production was just not coming to the markets to reach the industrial sector. The National Commission mourned that unique features of the food situation during the second plan period were the increasing demand for food grains and a steady decline in market arrivals despite higher production. The Indian planners were thus faced with the dilemma of increasing production and declining market arrivals, along with increasing independence of the agricultural sector from the urban sector. They saw the solution out of this dilemma in shifting attention from food-scarce areas and trying to make the areas that were already surplus in food more surplus. In 1959, the agricultural production team of the Ford Foundation recommended the intensive approach anew. And with the visible failure in the second plan to get the food to the market in spite of increasing production, a new Intensive Agricultural District Program IADP was launched in the closing years of the second plan. The expressed objective of the program was to concentrate resources and efforts in specially endowed areas to achieve a quick breakthrough in production. The program was expanded in 1964 under the name of Intensive Agricultural Area Program, or IAAP, to cover more of the well-endowed areas. The apparent argument in favor of these intensive approaches was that resources that are spread thin over large areas are lost, leaving no appreciable effect on production. It was suggested that only a package of practices involving concentrated doses of resources could be technologically effective, and that increased production achieved in these areas with improved practices would have a demonstration effect in other areas. The thrust of the IADP and IAAP programs was not on introduction of new technologies, but on the intensive application of resources like irrigation and fertilizers, etc. Traditional technologies evolved in a more egalitarian context, evolved in a context where the food needs of cultivators were more important than the needs of surpluses to support progress, were just not capable of making land absorb more than its due share of resources. The intensive packages approach to agricultural development being tried out in India since the 50s had really nothing to do with the technological efficacy. The policy, in fact, only expressed a political wish for a technology that could respond to these measures, a technology that would allow the concentration of resources and production in a few compact and already surplus areas. The policy was asking for a technology that would achieve technologically what the British had achieved politically, namely responsiveness of agriculture to the needs of the industry and the market in preference to the life needs of the cultivators. The development sought for in the agricultural sector was not one that will primarily meet the needs of the rural population, but one that will provide the resources and capital needed for the industrialization taking place in the urban centers. The planners were looking for ways to break the independence of the rural sector and bringing it into increasing dependence on the urban sector. They were keen on making the agricultural sector enter into increasing exchange relations with the urban industrial sector, with the terms of exchange so manipulated as to enable the urban sector to extract the maximum possible surplus from the rural sector. Since the 50s, the planners were in search of an agricultural technology that would bring about such a transformation. No such technology was available at the time the intensive approach policy was being formulated and implemented. By mid-60s, however, such a technology became available in the form of new miracle seeds that had proved successful in Mexico. These seeds were genetically selected to absorb huge doses of chemical fertilizers. Since these seeds had not evolved under natural conditions, they were susceptible to a number of pests and pathogens and needed to be grown under the protective cover of pesticides. The new seeds also required new sophisticated practices for irrigation, tillage, etc., etc. At the same time, it would make the agriculture critically dependent on industrial inputs like chemical fertilizers and pesticides and make the cultivator dependent upon the urban expert for the knowledge of the correct agricultural practices, thus removing the dangerous tendency of self-sufficiency in the agriculture sector for good. This technology, being highly expensive, could not possibly be extended on the whole country. All that was required was to make the surplus areas a little more surplus so that the urban industrial sector would be assured of its requirements. Acceptance of this technology would involve import of large amounts of fertilizers and pesticides, for India did not produce these. In the initial stages, even seeds would have to be imported. Providentially, there was a widespread failure of monsoon in 1965 and 1966 in India, as well as over the rest of South Asia and Southeast Asia. This failure led to the spectra of major famine. Foreign experts predicted doom. Some of them even suggested the possibility of 1 million starvation deaths taking place in Bihar alone. This situation removed all hesitation about accepting the new seeds, even if it involved massive imports. And in 1966-67, the new strategy of agricultural development with the program of introducing the new technology mainly in the areas covered by IADP and IAAP was launched. The program was declared an immediate success. This success is what came to be known as the Green Revolution. Dear students, this analysis of the Green Revolution has a substantial historical introduction, since we consider it is impossible to evaluate the revolution's merits without the understanding of the ongoing struggle between tradition and modernity in Indian agriculture since the arrival of the British. It's impossible to comprehend how this event, which did not increase the aggregate rates of growth of agricultural output, did not decrease agriculture's dependence on imports, and did not increase the per capita availability of food, came to be referred to as a revolution without understanding this historical urge for modernity in agriculture, for making agriculture responsive to the needs external to the life needs of the cultivators. With this, today's topic comes to its conclusion. Hope that you have understood every bit of the lecture. We shall be meeting again with some other topic in a new lecture. Till then, goodbye and good luck.